Picture this. You are crossing the North Atlantic in a wooden, open-decked ship. The vessel is approximately 20 meters long, beautifully constructed, crewed by 20 to 30 people who are not exactly positioned for comfort. There is no roof. There are no walls. The spray from the waves hits your face with a temperature of water that is somewhere between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of cold that stops feeling like cold after a while and starts feeling like a personal attack. The wind is either your propulsion system or your enemy, depending on which direction it's coming from, and right now it is coming from a direction that is not especially helpful. The sun set 3 hours ago. You are somewhere between Norway and Iceland, which means you are in the middle of one of the most hostile bodies of water on the planet, with no shelter, no GPS, no survival blanket, and approximately zero interest in dying out here because there is a new land to the west that your navigator has described with what turns out to be understated enthusiasm. And yet, you are managing. You are cold in the way that someone who grew up in Scandinavia and has been cold for significant portions of every year since childhood understands cold. Not as an emergency, but as a condition to be managed, worked around, and occasionally ignored with the practiced stoicism of someone who doesn't have the option of not being cold. This is the Viking relationship with cold. And it was not accidental. The first thing to establish before getting into any of the genuinely interesting biology and material culture is that the question of how Vikings survived cold without fire contains a trap worth acknowledging directly. Vikings absolutely had fire. They had fire at home, fire at sea when conditions permitted, fire on campaign when they could establish it. The longhouses of Scandinavia had central hearths running the length of the building. The Norse world understood fire extremely well and used it constantly. The question is better framed as, how did Vikings survive the cold in all the conditions where fire wasn't immediately accessible? How did they cross open oceans in open boats? How did they conduct winter campaigns in Russia and the British Isles? How did they conduct the daily outdoor labor of a northern subsistence economy, fishing through ice, tending livestock in blizzards, hauling timber, traveling between settlements, without the kind of warm building access that modern people treat as a baseline requirement of human existence? And the deeper version of the question, why were they so much more capable of managing cold environments than most modern people from temperate or warm climates, even modern people with access to far superior material technology? The answer is a system. Not any single element, but an integrated set of adaptations: physiological, material, architectural, dietary, cultural, and social, that together produced a population genuinely capable of inhabiting and functioning in one of the harshest climate zones on the planet. Begin with the clothing, because it is the most immediately visible part of the cold survival system, and also one of the most technically impressive components of Viking material culture. The foundation was wool. Not generic wool, the wool produced by the Old Norse sheep breeds indigenous to Scandinavia, particularly the Vilsau and Spelsau breeds, whose fleeces had been evolving in Nordic conditions for centuries. These fleeces have a dual structure: long outer guard hairs that resist water, and a dense, fine inner coat that provides insulation. The lanolin content of these fleeces, the natural waxy substance secreted by sheep that coats the fiber, provides water repellence at the material level. Water doesn't just slide off lanolin-rich wool, it takes extended exposure for the fiber to become saturated, and even partially saturated lanolin-rich wool retains significant insulative capacity because the fiber's crimped structure maintains air pockets even when wet. This is the property that makes wool categorically different from most alternative insulation materials in the context of northern maritime and winter conditions. Cotton, when wet, loses nearly all insulative value because the fiber lies flat and collapses the air pockets that provide warmth. Wool, when wet, retains meaningful insulation because the fiber's crimp structure resists full compression even as moisture content increases. A wet wool garment in a cold wind is unpleasant. It is not the emergency that a wet cotton garment in the same conditions represents. Viking-age textile production transformed this exceptional raw material into garments through weaving techniques that produced fabrics of varying density for different thermal applications. Tightly woven heavy wool gave wind resistance and water resistance. Lighter woven intermediate layers provided insulation. The fabrics could be fulled, a process of applying heat, moisture, and agitation that causes the wool fibers to interlock and shrink, producing a denser, more weather-resistant material approaching felt in properties. Fulled wool was significantly more windproof and water-resistant than unfulled fabric of equivalent weight. The layering system, linen against the skin for moisture management, progressively heavier wool layers for insulation, heavy outer garments for wind and water resistance, was not based on any theoretical understanding of insulation physics. It was based on accumulated generational knowledge of what worked, transmitted through practical experience, and refined over centuries of cold climate living. That the empirical result matches what modern thermal engineering would prescribe is evidence not of coincidence, but of the effectiveness of iterative empirical refinement over long time periods. The headgear and hand coverings of Viking Age Scandinavia deserve examination because extremity and head warmth are disproportionately important for cold survival in ways that the overall layering system needs to address. Heat loss from an uncovered head in cold conditions is substantial. Estimates vary, but the head represents a significant fraction of total body heat loss because of its high surface area to volume ratio, the relatively high metabolic rate of brain tissue requiring continuous blood flow, and the absence of significant subcutaneous fat insulation compared to the torso. Norse wool caps, close-fitting, sometimes lined with fur, covering the ears, addressed this directly. Mittens, rather than fingered gloves, were the preferred hand covering for cold Nordic conditions, and the preference reflects practical thermal knowledge. Mittens allow the fingers to share heat with each other, creating a collective warm airspace within the mitten that fingered gloves cannot replicate. The total surface area exposed to the outer environment is substantially lower in a mitten than in a gloved hand at equivalent total coverage, reducing thermal loss accordingly. Modern cold weather practitioners rediscover this regularly. The mitten is not a primitive antecedent to the glove. It is a superior thermal solution for conditions where fine manual dexterity is less important than maintaining hand function through warmth. Boot construction incorporated the same layering principle as the overall clothing system. Multiple layers of wool wrapping the foot and lower leg, accommodated within leather boots constructed loosely enough to avoid compression of the insulation layers, provided warmth through both insulation and the avoidance of the circulation restriction that tight footwear in cold conditions creates. The blood supply to the feet depends on unconstricted vessels, and the decision to wear loose-fitting boots with generous wool, layering inside reflects knowledge, whether articulated or not, of what happens to circulation and therefore warmth when footwear is too tight. The longhouses thermal architecture is where fire comes back into the analysis, and the fire of the Viking longhouse was used more intelligently than a simple build-a-fire summary suggests. A typical Icelandic or Norwegian longhouse was constructed with thick walls, often turf in Iceland, where timber was scarce but turf was abundant. That provided both insulation and thermal mass. Thermal mass is the capacity of a material to absorb and slowly release heat, moderating temperature swings by storing warmth when the fire is hot and releasing it when the fire diminishes. Turf walls with high thermal mass created a temperature-stabilizing effect that prevented the rapid cooling that thin timber walls would allow when fire output varied overnight. The central hearth, running the length of the interior rather than positioned at one wall, distributed warmth across the occupied space more efficiently than a single end-positioned fire. The open hearth without a chimney retained more heat in the structure than chimney-equipped fireplaces, which draw heated air upward and out of the building through convective draft. The smoke that accumulated near the apex of the longhouse roof was the inconvenient cost of this thermal efficiency. Norse longhouses were smoky environments, but the thermal benefit was meaningful. More of the fire's heat remained in the occupied space. Animals housed in attached sections of the longhouse contributed metabolic heat that was not trivial. A section containing several cattle or horses generates substantial body heat from the combined metabolic output of multiple large warm-blooded animals. In a well-sealed structure, this heat contribution from livestock raised ambient temperatures meaningfully. The decision to integrate livestock housing with human living space was driven by multiple practical considerations: easier animal management, mutual protection. But the thermal contribution of the animals was a real and recognized benefit in communities where every source of warmth was valued. Sea survival is where the Viking cold management system was tested most severely, and examining how Norse sailors survived extended open water passages reveals the most extreme applications of the system's principles. The Viking longship provided essentially no shelter from the elements. Its design was optimized for speed, shallow draft, and the ability to be beached directly rather than requiring harbor infrastructure. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. A revolutionary approach to maritime mobility. But the trade-off was exposure. Sailors on a longship were exposed to wind, spray, rain, and whatever the North Atlantic felt like providing continuously for the duration of the voyage. The hudfat, the sleeping bag used by Norse sailors on extended voyages, was the single most important thermal technology for open-sea cold survival. Constructed from animal hides, typically marine mammal skins including seal and walrus with the fur retained, the hudfat provided a sealed thermal environment that a sailor could climb into and maintain body heat through the night watch periods. Marine mammal skin has exceptional waterproof properties. Seals have been solving the problem of staying warm in cold ocean water for millions of years, and the material properties of their skin reflect that evolutionary history. A sleeping bag made from such material and kept from direct water saturation could maintain significant warmth even in the thermal conditions of a North Atlantic overnight at sea. The practice of sailors sleeping in pairs or groups within the confined space of the longship added shared body heat to the thermal equation. Multiple people in close proximity in an enclosed sleeping arrangement, even without insulated sleeping bags, generate enough collective metabolic heat to substantially raise the local temperature relative to the ambient. Norse sailors were acclimatized to this kind of communal sleeping from longhouse life at home, where communal sleeping arrangements were normal rather than extraordinary. Navigation rotations meant that not all sailors were simultaneously exposed to the worst conditions. Those on rest periods could retreat to the most protected positions on the ship and enter sleeping bags while others maintained watch and sail management. This rotation distributed the peak cold exposure across the crew rather than concentrating it on any individual for extended periods, reducing cumulative cold stress for each crew member. Physiological cold acclimatization is the biological component of the Viking cold survival system, and it is arguably the most important component because it operated continuously and without requiring any active decision or technology. Cold acclimatization is a documented physiological phenomenon with multiple measurable mechanisms. Regular cold exposure, particularly repeated mild to moderate cold stress over extended periods, produces upregulation of non-shivering thermogenesis, the metabolic production of heat through mechanisms other than muscle shivering. The primary site of non-shivering thermogenesis in mammals is brown adipose tissue, a specialized fat with high mitochondrial density that generates heat through uncoupled oxidative metabolism, burning fuel to produce heat directly rather than primarily producing mechanical work or ATP. Adult humans who grow up and live in cold environments maintain substantially more active brown adipose tissue than people who live in thermally neutral environments. The research demonstrating this is relatively recent. The significance of brown adipose tissue in adult human thermogenesis was not recognized until the development of PET scanning revealed metabolically active brown fat deposits in adult humans living in cold climates. Pre-modern populations in cold climates were running higher levels of brown fat-mediated thermogenesis than their warm climate contemporaries without any understanding of the mechanism. Cold acclimatization also shifts the temperature at which shivering begins. Acclimated people begin shivering at lower temperatures than unacclimated people, indicating that their system tolerates greater cold stress before engaging the energetically expensive shivering response. This expanded range of cold tolerance without shivering means that acclimated individuals can maintain calm, efficient physical performance through cold stress that would produce the energy-wasting, dexterity-impairing shivering response in unacclimated people. Viking-age Scandinavians were cold acclimated from birth. Infants were not kept in thermally neutral environments. They were exposed to the ambient conditions of Northern European life from the earliest days. Children participated in outdoor activities year-round, regardless of temperature. Adolescents engaged in the full outdoor labor of subsistence farming, fishing, and herding through winter conditions. By adulthood, a Norse person had accumulated years of cold exposure that had optimized their thermogenic physiology for the conditions they regularly faced. This was not a deliberate health practice, it was simply the consequence of living without the thermal engineering that modern civilization provides. Dietary strategy provided the metabolic fuel for the thermogenic demands of cold climate life, and the Viking diet was extraordinarily well suited to this function. High-fat intake is the most thermogenically efficient dietary strategy for cold conditions. Dietary fat provides more calories per gram than carbohydrate or protein, provides the substrate for brown adipose tissue thermogenesis, and produces a slower, more sustained metabolic fuel release than carbohydrate metabolism. The Viking diet was fat-rich by any standard. Fatty fish, including herring, salmon, and cod, were dietary staples. Animal fats from cattle, sheep, pigs, and marine mammals were used in cooking and consumed directly. Dairy products including butter, skyr, and aged cheeses contributed substantial fat calories. The thermogenic effect of protein is also substantial. The metabolic processing of dietary protein generates more heat per calorie consumed than carbohydrate processing, a phenomenon called dietary-induced thermogenesis, or the thermic effect of food. A high-protein meal in cold conditions contributes to thermal maintenance through the heat generated by its own digestion. The Norse diet's high protein content from meat, fish, and dairy provided both nutritional completeness and this thermogenic contribution. The preservation of fatty foods through fermentation and drying allowed the high-fat diet to be maintained through winter months when fresh food availability was limited. Dried fish, skrei, the wind-dried Atlantic cod that became a major Norse trade commodity, provided concentrated protein and fat in a preserved form that maintained its nutritional value through extended storage. Fermented dairy products maintained the fat and protein content of fresh dairy, while adding the nutritional benefits of fermentation and extending shelf life through the preservation effect of lactic acid fermentation. Community organization functioned as a thermal survival system in ways that extended beyond the individual clothing and physiological adaptations. The longhouses' communal design meant that the thermal resources of the community, fire, livestock body heat, human body heat, stored food, were pooled and shared rather than fragmented into isolated household units. A community of 20 or 30 people occupying a shared space generates more total metabolic heat, requires proportionally less fuel to maintain minimum temperatures, and provides mutual monitoring for cold stress symptoms than 20 or 30 individuals occupying separate small shelters. The Norse hospitality tradition, the cultural obligation to provide food and shelter to travelers, was not merely social convention. In the cold geography of Scandinavia, where a traveler caught between settlements in winter conditions was at real risk of cold injury, the community obligation to provide shelter functioned as a distributed survival network. A traveler could count on finding shelter within a reasonable distance because the cultural norms made that provision obligatory rather than optional. This network effect, the reliable availability of warm shelter at intervals across the settled landscape, reduced the risk profile of winter travel substantially. Knowledge transmission within communities ensured that cold survival knowledge was preserved and reliably available. The practical knowledge of how to read weather, how to recognize cold injury symptoms in companions, how to construct emergency shelter from available materials, how to ration food and fuel during extended cold exposure, this knowledge lived in the community rather than in any external system. Experienced elders who had survived many northern winters carried knowledge that younger community members were expected to learn and eventually transmit in turn. The psychological dimension of the Viking-cold relationship deserves serious consideration rather than being dismissed as mere cultural bravado. Cold survival is substantially a behavioral challenge. The physiological mechanisms for managing cold exposure, thermogenesis, vasoconstriction, Behavioral thermoregulation are most effective when the person experiencing cold is managing their behavioral responses rationally rather than reactively. Panic responses to cold, frantic activity that produces sweating, and then dangerous chilling, poor decision making about shelter versus continued travel, failure to maintain the slow, deliberate movements that conserve both warmth and energy, are documented contributors to cold related fatalities in people who would otherwise have survived their exposure. Norse cultural values explicitly celebrated stoic endurance of physical hardship and cold. The saga literature is full of descriptions of men and women managing cold conditions with matter-of-fact competence rather than distress. The religious framework, the vision of Valhalla, the honor around dying well in difficult circumstances, the cultural celebration of those who maintained capability and composure under harsh conditions, produced a population with reduced behavioral reactivity to cold discomfort. This psychological preparation is not the same as anesthetic indifference to cold. Norse people experienced cold discomfort. Their literature acknowledges it. What the cultural framework provided was a framework for interpreting cold discomfort as a condition to be managed rather than an emergency requiring immediate termination. People who have been culturally trained to interpret cold as manageable make better behavioral decisions in cold conditions than people whose cultural framework treats cold discomfort as an emergency signal requiring immediate response. The combination of genuine physiological cold tolerance from lifelong acclimatization with cultural psychological preparation for cold endurance produced people who were, by any reasonable behavioral and physiological measure, substantially more capable in cold conditions than most contemporary people from warmer or more thermally managed environments. What the complete picture reveals is not Viking superhuman biology or magical cold resistance. It is a complete system: material, physiological, dietary, architectural, social, psychological, that was built iteratively over generations by a population that had no option of opting out of cold, and therefore had every incentive to solve it as completely as possible. The wool clothing system addressed the insulation and moisture management challenge. The layering approach addressed thermal regulation during varying activity. The longhouse design captured and retained available heat as efficiently as available materials allowed. The diet fueled the metabolic demands of continuous thermogenesis. The physiological acclimatization produced thermal management capabilities that modern heated living has atrophied. The community organization pooled resources and spread risk. The cultural psychology reduced the behavioral failures that make manageable cold exposure into dangerous cold exposure. None of these elements was sufficient alone. Together, they formed a coherent system that produced a population capable of crossing the North Atlantic in open boats, conducting winter campaigns across Russia, fishing through Arctic sea ice, and raising families in conditions that modern people experience as genuinely dangerous. The person on the longship in the North Atlantic spray is not performing a feat of exceptional individual endurance. They are running a system that their entire life has prepared them for, equipped with materials their culture had refined for centuries, fueled by food their ecology provided, and supported by a community of people whose shared knowledge included exactly how to manage the situation they were in. The cold didn't become less cold. The system became good enough to handle it anyway. That is the answer. Not one thing. The whole system, built over generations by people who had to get it right.